is the Taliban or their friends or their enemies like ISIL and so on and so forth.
Marwan, you mentioned intelligence failures there, but there were warnings about this, including within the U.S. intelligence community, and they spoke very openly about this. What I am curious about, though, is what all of this now means for the Taliban. I mean, they're clearly wanting to take control and have some kind of government in place in Kabul, given that we are seeing a deterioration of the security situation there, ostensibly under their control. What does this mean for their possibilities for actually governing?
To be clear, I did not say there's intelligence failure about the incident today. I was saying there's intelligence failure about predicting how long the puppet government or the government in Afghanistan was going to survive after the American troops leave. It turned out to be they were not surviving more than a couple of hours, a couple of days, a couple of weeks. Clearly, the CIA did not give President Biden the right intelligence about how much do these people, or could these people survive without American support? And let me just delve very briefly about this, because clearly there were too many lies about the preparation of the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government. Clearly, much of the training of the Afghan forces and the tens of billions of dollars went to private contractors. And those private contractors are in it for the money, not for the future of Afghanistan. And clearly, many or most of these fighters, the 100,000, 300,000 Afghan fighters, which, by the way, I don't know where they are today. Where are they? We don't know where they are. 300,000 Afghan soldiers were trained using tens of billions of dollars. They all disappeared simply because they were more capable of running traffic lights than running counterinsurgencies. So the idea that there was major intelligence failure about what was this government able to do and what should the United States do and what contingency plan should it have if it falls immediately after the withdrawal starts, that was a big, big failure. And everything that we're seeing today and we will be seeing the next few weeks is all about that intelligence failure. Now, what we're seeing, even more importantly from the White House, if you and our viewers around the world listen to the briefings from the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, and so on and so forth, numbers. We evacuated this many, this hour, this Tuesday, that Wednesday, so many flights. It's all about numbers, figures. But one image today of that one or two bombings, one image of those Afghans trying to hold on to those airplanes in Kabul airport is certainly speak louder than 1,000 figure that the administration can give. So in as far even the public relation campaign by this administration, they're not up to the level in the sense that, and by the way, here is a very important thing that I heard you asking every other of our reporters and your guests about, and I think it's probably the most fundamental question is, will Joe Biden change his mind about the August 31st? Even though he was right to insist on August 31st, not because this is a sacred deadline, because you must have a deadline. One, two, this is an open wound with all these images coming from Afghanistan. This is a disaster, both for the Biden administration, for American policy, for American credibility, for American allies, and so on and so forth.
Marwan,
so the idea that you
Marwan,
this wound,
you're talking about how this is a disaster for the U.S. I'm also curious about how much of a disaster this is for the Taliban, because by my understanding, ISIL-K, if they are indeed responsible for this, and obviously no claim of responsibility yet, but if they are indeed, as people are speculating, if they did actually carry this out, this represents essentially an attack on something linked to the Taliban by defectors from the Taliban. So what does this mean for the stability of Kabul and Afghanistan going forward?
This is going to be a key question moving forward, but I am not as frantically worried about it as as the question seems to convey, because I think, and your guest started with that answer before, but did not really get to the heart of the matter, is that, look, Afghans are Hanafi Muslims. ISIS is a Hanbali Muslims. They are Salafists. The Salafists are nothing like the Taliban. Taliban is a conservative Hanafi group. So in terms of the schools of Islam, most Afghans follow the Taliban. ISIS, like it was in Iraq, it is in Afghanistan. It's more like an outsider coming in. So yes, they will present a danger. Yes, they will present a threat. But I don't think the Taliban is worried that ISIL will take Afghanistan from them. They will be a nuisance. And for the time being, by the way, they are not exactly a nuisance. I think the Taliban is sitting back and looking at the U.S. being humiliated by, not itself, apparently, reportedly, perhaps by ISIL. And that is not to the disadvantage of the Taliban, because after 20 years of war with the United States, it is now obliged to bite the bullet, as it were, and allow the United States to withdraw. But look, 20 years back, when the Taliban lost the war in 2001, October, and from then on, the United States did not exactly allow them to evacuate comfortably out of Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan. So what we see today is the Taliban forced to accept some American conditions in order for the United States and its Western allies to deal with the Taliban moving forward, and even to give them some assistance and aid, to recognize them, and so on and so forth. So much of what we see from the Taliban today, including its hostility and condemnation of ISIL, yes, it is part of its attempt at maintaining some thread, some contact, some relationship with Western capital, even though it does have other options like Beijing, perhaps Russia and others, but it does want the West, because it understands that moving forward, it will need international help, it will need international recognition, including to fight ISIL. I think the other more sensitive question, by the way, is its relationship with Al-Qaeda. That is not final. We don't know, and I think the Americans don't have enough intelligence that I have seen about where is the Taliban going with Al-Qaeda, because that's a whole other different ballgame from the relationship with ISIL. Al-Qaeda is much closer to the Taliban. They've been since before 2000 or 2001, and according to some report, they continue to be close. According to some report, they still maintain relationship. But one of the conditions of the agreement between the Trump administration and the Taliban is that the Taliban will not allow Al-Qaeda safe haven in Afghanistan. Will this then be a card that the Taliban will use with the United States moving forward to say, okay, we will deny Al-Qaeda a base in Afghanistan if you do this and this and that for us? So again, all of these will be for the Taliban a strategy of dealing with the United States. The question, once again, what is the American strategy of dealing with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIL and the mess after 20 years in Afghanistan?
Well, Marwan, we've talked a lot about the Western reaction to all of this, the US, and we've also been hearing reaction, obviously, from the UK and Europe. I wonder what Moscow and Beijing are thinking as they're watching what happened in Kabul today. There were obviously great concerns about stability of the region, a really strategic area for both countries. What do they want to see going forward?
I think there's probably paradoxical reaction coming or in the minds of the leaders in Beijing and Moscow. One, they're very happy that the United States is being humiliated by the Taliban after 20 years, that it's a second Vietnam, if you will. And China, especially, is already trying to benefit, to leverage U.S. failures in Asia, because China wants to be the #1 power in Asia. It wants to be the Asian power, because that's the only way it could become a global power. And hence, the more America loses in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, the more China can benefit. And it already has major relationship with Pakistan and Iran, and it's already offered and met with the Taliban in order to have more relationship with the Taliban regime moving forward. So China will benefit. And yet, I would say that China is worried about the inspiration that what's happening in Afghanistan and the success of the Taliban might bring out in various jihadi groups in Asia, including among the Chinese Muslims and so on and so forth. So China is worried about some of its interests in Asia, especially in Muslim countries, as well as among its own Muslim population. Once again, on the one hand, it's happy that the U.S. is being humiliated so that it could benefit from that strategically. But on the other, there might be some worry about the Taliban's inspiration to various jihadi and radical groups within Asia and within China itself.
And Marwan, before I let you go, I do want to ask you about this line that we're getting from the Taliban. They're being very clear. They're condemning these blasts, but they're being very, very specific. They're saying that this is happening in an area where U.S. forces are responsible. And they're saying that the only reason they even happened was because of the presence of foreign forces on the ground. And we're seeing a number of countries now halt their evacuation flights. Do you think that this could actually have the opposite effect than people are speculating about, rather than extending the 31st of August deadline, that everyone might actually want to get out a little bit sooner?
I think the 31st of August is going to be important simply because they must have a deadline, and because they agreed to it. And two, because they want to close this wound. And this is a wound. This is a major public relations disaster. It's a major humiliation for the United States. The Taliban also has been insisting that they must leave. And I must add something else to that. You know, with tens of thousands of people leaving Afghanistan, many of them professionals, the Taliban has already been condemning the sort of brain drain out of Afghanistan. Because when you ensure that tens of thousands of professionals, doctors and lawyers and engineers and so on and so forth leave Afghanistan, how will the Taliban run the capital, let alone run the country? It's going to need a lot of these bureaucrats, a lot of these administrative people, a lot of these professionals, and so on and so forth. So what is happening day by day, as Biden and Blinken have been saying, is that we moved out 10,000, 15,000, and the Taliban is worried that many of them are leaving, and it's left with not that many professionals. And let's all remember that the Taliban made sure from the very first day to say we are giving amnesty to all those people who worked in the Afghan government under American or with American cooperation and so on and so forth, because they were very careful, and they know all too well, if they lose all the manpower and they lose all the aid, how the heck they're going to be able to run the government, run the country? How are they going to be able to pay salaries, and to whom? So these are very important questions for the Taliban as well. So the Taliban also has an interest for this to finish by August 31st. The Biden administration has interest for this to finish August 31st. The European leaders expressed some difference because they are not under the heat as much as the Biden administration is nowadays.
Well, Marwan, given that we've seen that there are divisions within the Taliban, both in the past and now, and the World Bank is already cutting funding, they're facing all these challenges. We're seeing appointments also being made to different government departments. Is it realistic that the Taliban is going to be able to unify itself and actually form some kind of government going forward, especially given that, as you suggested, there's not a lot of money and certainly at the moment not a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the international community? Where does this go from here?
This is the $64 million question, right? I think history tells us, the history books are full of examples of successful counterinsurgency turning into miserable, incompetent governments. So generally speaking, the golden rule is counterinsurgents don't make for good governors. And I think the Taliban might end up proving to be one as such, because, fighting and being in the mountains of Afghanistan, that, creates a lot of adrenaline. But governing is really more about running the sewers and so on and so forth. It's very boring, and it's very sedative, and it takes a whole other mindset than that one of fighting and jihad and so on and so forth. And clearly, as you stated, it's going to need a lot of money, because now the country is in bad shape, and because of the brain drain that we're seeing. How will the Taliban pay the salaries of thousands upon thousands? Two, if Afghanistan has anything, that it could use, that it could invest in, is its minerals. But that requires investments. They say that Afghanistan is the Saudi Arabia of lithium, right? And that's hugely important nowadays in everything that we do, from electric cars, batteries, to our iPhone batteries and so forth. It is crucial. It's more important than oil. And Afghanistan has perhaps $2 trillion of such minerals. But they're going to need investments. They're going to need companies coming in. Hence, they're going to need stability. They're going to need money. They're going to need to be long-term planning. Is the Taliban able to have that in Afghanistan moving forward? I doubt it. Certainly not without the help of Pakistan and Iran, investments from China, certainly green light from the United States, assistance from Europe, and so on and so forth. But all of that means a change of attitude, not change of words, change of attitude on the part of the Taliban. Is the Taliban ready to change attitude? Probably not, because as you said, even the Taliban itself is split among different factions, and apparently the Haqqani group seems to be the one coming up on top, which is the more radical group within the Taliban.
It'll be a very interesting few weeks, well, days and weeks ahead, indeed. Marwan Bashara, the Al Jazeera senior political analyst, thanks for joining us again and sharing your expertise. Hello there. If you're just joining us, I'm Nastasia Tay, and we're live from Doha as we continue our coverage of breaking news from Afghanistan. It is currently 9:30 p.m. in Kabul, and at least 13 people have been killed, several injured in 2 blasts outside Kabul airport. Several European countries and Canada have stopped their evacuations early because of the security concerns in Afghanistan. Well, there have been 2 explosions outside Kabul airport. The Taliban is saying now at least 13 people have been killed, many more injured. But medical sources are saying the number of dead could actually be as high as 25. This all comes after the United States, Australia and the UK warned people to stay away because of what they were calling an imminent threat from an ISIL offshoot in the country. Thousands, though, had been gathering outside the airport for days now in hopes of fleeing the country after the Taliban took over. Well, the Taliban has since condemned the blasts. Their spokesman has tweeted, and I quote, "The Islamic Emirate strongly condemns the bombing targeting civilians at Kabul airport. The explosion took place in an area where U.S. forces are responsible for security." Well, we have multiple correspondents covering this for us. Charlie Angela is there for us in London, across European reaction as well. Alan Fisher is monitoring reactions from the Pentagon in the U.S., Kimberly Halkett is outside the White House. But first, let's speak to Rob McBride. He's on the ground there for us in Kabul. Rob, as we've been saying, this mounting death toll, and we know dozens injured in hospital, a very fast-moving story. Can you talk us through what we know right now?
That's right. This was an extremely deadly attack. It happened late Thursday afternoon, local time here in Afghanistan. And it was at the so-called Abbey Gate. This is one of the gates at Kabul International Airport. It's one of the gates where we've seen these scenes of chaos over the days this week and also last week. It was one of the gates that was being used by people who are eligible for evacuation flights, who've been going in to get onto flights, but also we've seen people there thronging the gates, people trying to get on. Some of them maybe legitimately have reason to be on those flights and have been cleared to be on those flights, but there are lots of other people who are just desperate to get on any flights they can to get out of Afghanistan. We know that there was one explosion first of all, but this was called what they know is called a complex attack. It was planned to be in different stages, and it was shortly followed by a second explosion. A colleague from French television who is close by has reported seeing a surge of people coming away from the point of this explosion. A lot of them at the front of this crowd of people carrying injured people injured in the blast. Among them, sadly, a number of children. Also, amongst all of this crowd surging away from the scene, a lot of Taliban firing in the air, trying to disperse the crowds. There are some reports of maybe in the confusion and maybe exchanges of gunfire with some of the militaries of the different countries around the perimeter of the airport, but that has not been confirmed. But certainly scenes that we have been uploaded onto social media and that we're now seeing here in our office really show utter devastation at the scene of this explosion. As you could imagine, it was in a very crowded area and an awful lot of bodies of men, women and children. And we know from scenes that have been reaching us from a number of clinics and hospitals, they have really been inundated with injured being taken to all of these places. So the casualty figures are still not known at this stage, but we are talking in terms of scores of casualties, in terms of people injured and also dead. And it came at the end of a very tense day. For the last 24, 36 hours, we have been hearing repeated warnings about an imminent attack from Islamic State, some sort of bombing at the airport, which is a very vulnerable target, as we know. In fact, we were talking to one security source, an operative who's been here in Kabul for a number of years now, and he says he had never seen a warning like this being confirmed by so many sources, so many countries, so many intelligence agencies and militaries of so many countries, including the Taliban. The Taliban have been warning about this attack as well, and also warning that its soldiers now, its Taliban fighters, were also going to be in the front line should there be an attack like this, which there has been this Thursday evening.
Well, the Taliban, I believe, Rob, are now saying that the presence of foreign forces there are to blame for the attack. You mentioned that they were fairly frantic in the aftermath of those blasts. There was plenty of chaos. What is the situation like on the streets now there? Is the Taliban on top of things in terms of security?
I mean, the Taliban, as everybody else, is looking at the airport as really the major focus now for security concerns. That's where all the chaos is. That's where, sadly, we have seen people trampled in stampedes. We've seen all of these scenes of chaos that has been around the airport. And the Taliban have blamed squarely and, in their view, fairly, the Americans for this, for their continued presence. They don't want to see them extend their operation past August the 31st. They blame the US for not allowing some of these crowds of people into the airport itself. They say it would take the pressure off this perimeter, the pressure which they have had to bear. And in recent days, they have had to try to bolster with the introduction of special forces, try to push people back from the perimeter. So it could be argued they would blame the Americans, wouldn't they? But they certainly say the Americans are to blame and have contributed to a lot of the chaos that we're seeing there at the airport. Elsewhere in the capital, it's a different scene. The Taliban does seem to be in charge. You see their presence. They have a very high profile. They are at checkpoints around the streets. For the past week or more, we have seen a gradual increase in Taliban. They have been manning roadblocks. They have been outside the front of ministries or potential other targets, such as hotels where there are foreigners, keeping largely control. There has been some tension on the streets. There has been an uneasy calm, but by and large, the Taliban very much, you do get the sense that they are cementing their control, their hold on Kabul, and the hope is that gradually people will get used to them being on the streets, that people are uneasy about having the Taliban here after 20 years and having their return, but the Taliban's hope is that gradually people will become accustomed, will become easier at least of having their presence here in Kabul.
Rob McBride there on the streets of Kabul for us with all the latest. Thank you so much, Rob. Well, let's now cross over to Washington, D.C. and speak to Alan Fisher. He's across all the reaction from there. Alan, I believe we are now hearing from officials that a number of American troops are among the dead. What else are you hearing from the Pentagon?
The U.S. ambassador in Kabul has confirmed just in the last few minutes that 4 American Marines have been killed and 3 others have been injured in the bombing at Kabul airport. Interestingly enough, 24 hours ago, suspected suicide bomber. That is because there was a high security alert. They had credible evidence that there was going to be an attack. And so the troops were warned, this is what you need to look for. This is what you need to keep an eye on. And still, even after that warning, they were processing people through those gates, risking their own lives to make sure that these people could get out of the country. The bomb blast came at Abbey Gate. It was a complex attack, according to the Pentagon, not just because there was one bomb blast at Abbey Gate, as people moved away from the area towards Barnes Hotel, where many foreigners had been staged, including Americans, and Americans had been led away from there just shortly before the bombing. That is where the second bomb went off, killing a number of people there as well. So just to To reiterate what we've been told just in the last few minutes, the US ambassador in Kabul confirming that there are 4 US Marines dead and 3 have been injured.
Alan, no claim of responsibility yet, but obviously, as Rob was saying, plenty of warnings, plenty of threats around an attack like this. What are you hearing from security sources there around who they think was behind this? I know there's been lots of talk.
Well, if you look at the timeline, on Tuesday, Joe Biden spoke to the American people. He said, look, there is a threat from ISIL-K, which is the offshoot of ISIL, which operates in Afghanistan, has been responsible for a number of attacks, particularly this year. He said that there was a threat. The Taliban were aware of it, but more importantly, the Americans were aware of it. You flash forward 24 hours, and the US Embassy in Kabul is warning people that there is a threat, a credible threat of a possible attack, and so Americans and others should stay away from the gates at the airport and also away from the airport environs itself. And then less than 24 hours after that, in fact, about 12 hours later, you have this attack. So people are drawing the direct line from A through to C and saying they believe that ISIL-K was certainly responsible for this. This, if true, then causes a huge problem for Joe Biden. Although he has said every time he's asked, no, he doesn't trust the Taliban, one of the things that has been negotiated in Qatar and in other places is that the Taliban say no groups will be allowed to use Afghanistan as a base for operations. If the Taliban cannot stop ISIL-K from launching an operation like this right in the heart of Kabul, there will be questions about just how big their writ lies in Afghanistan itself to try and stop other groups launching attacks, not just in Afghanistan itself, but perhaps even targeting the United States, which, of course, takes us back to 20 years ago and what happened with al-Qaeda operating out of Afghanistan and the attacks that we saw in the United States. So this poses a real question for Joe Biden on security, and not one he's going to be easily able to walk away from. He has been briefed. There are contingency plans if they want to extend the August 31st deadline. Lloyd Austin, who is the Defence Secretary, was with the President in the Situation Room for a few hours this morning. He's now back at the Pentagon, and clearly there will be some hard thinking to do across the Potomac at the Pentagon and in the White House itself.
Well, let's cross the Potomac now. Alan Fisher there with all the latest for us from the Pentagon. We'll have all the live briefing for you here later on when that happens. But let's speak in the meantime to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, as Alan was mentioning there, President Biden spending quite a few hours today in the Situation Room, and his schedule really upended today as well.
Yeah, that's right. The U.S. president was scheduled to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. That has been delayed. We don't know if that meeting now will happen today or whether it has been pushed off to tomorrow. It is still unclear. In fact, we don't have a sense of the president's precise schedule, and that is because he's continuing to be briefed regularly by his team of advisors. Earlier in the day, he was in the Situation Room, we can confirm, where he met with his Secretary of State, his Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, also the Vice President of the United States returning to the U.S. from her tour in Asia. Kamala Harris, aboard Air Force Two, was also participating in those briefings virtually. This is so that they could assess the intelligence that has been coming in since these two reported blasts. And of course, there are concerns that there could be more. And as a result, the United States interacting with the commanders on the ground in Kabul and around Afghanistan in order to try and coordinate next steps. Now, officially, the U.S. president and the White House still sticking with that August 31st withdrawal date for the U.S. troops to leave Afghanistan. But the U.S. president, when he announced that date, said it was contingent on the Taliban ensuring that the evacuations could continue and that there would continue to be safe passage to and from the Kabul airport. Well, obviously, that has not been the case. Now, we have not had full claims of responsibility for these attacks, but already I can tell you that members of Congress are blaming the Taliban, including one member of the president's own Democratic Party, Bob Menendez, a prominent senator and chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, saying that he condemns these attacks and also says, as we wait for more details, one thing is clear: we can't trust the Taliban with American security. This is a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. And not surprisingly, the president's Republican critics on Capitol Hill also seizing on this to criticize the U.S. president, saying he has blood on his hands, and also from one veteran, now a representative in Congress in the House of Representatives, Dan Crenshaw, saying we are still at war, accusing the president of not ending the war, but just giving the enemy the new advantage or a new advantage, and he is encouraging the president to go on the offense. Senator Lindsey Graham in the U.S. Senate taking it a step further, saying on social media that I urge the Biden administration to reestablish our presence at Bagram as an alternative to the Kabul airport. Now, of course, we should remember that Bagram is where the U.S. forces were posted when theater in country. It was another day of risk. But now, as Alan Fisher has reported, we have seen there are American casualties, American troop casualties, and deaths and injuries. And so this is certainly going to put the pressure on Joe Biden even more to perhaps examine the contingency plans that he had the Pentagon draw up in terms of what happens next.
Kimberly, you mentioned all the pressure and the criticism on Joe Biden, not only from Congress, but and actually also the Republicans, but also he's been facing a lot of criticism from his own party. Now that we have seen these casualties within the U.S. troops who are in Kabul, does that change the calculus now, the political calculus going forward for Biden?
Well, what it does is it makes the president much more politically vulnerable. There were two members of Congress, one Democrat, one Republican, that went to Afghanistan against the wishes of Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, in order to conduct oversight on this evacuation process because they were so concerned. And in fact, one Democratic member, and it's important to point out, these aren't just members of Congress, these are U.S. veterans that traveled over there against the wishes of their colleagues, that they said that American lives would be lost if the president continued with this August 31st deadline. Now that has occurred. And that is going to be very difficult for the president to respond to, as this is a White House that has been struggling to find its footing with respect to Afghanistan. They have cast blame on the previous Trump administration for striking this deal that they say predicated the withdrawal. But the bottom line is the U.S. president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, and he is currently sitting in the Oval Office, not his predecessor. So these real-time decisions that are being made now in consultation with the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and members of his cabinet and intelligence officials, those squarely fall on Joe Biden's shoulders. And we can tell you that here in the United States, his approval rating has been falling as a result of how this is playing out. The optics of so many people desperate at the airport, not just American citizens, but also Afghans who supported the U.S. mission for a generation, now desperately trying to flee. This is not playing well on American television screens and on their personal smartphone devices where they may be getting their news. We've seen the poll numbers. The president, who came into office so popular after a very controversial Donald Trump, now seeing his approval ratings, according to some of the latest polls, falling into the low 40%, and the disapproval rating for the first time, I believe, above 50%. So this is concerning for this president, but I suspect it is not the political ramifications that this president is dealing with right now. He is very well versed and adept when it comes to foreign policy. And this really is a test of his presidency now and of those skills acquired as a U.S. senator as he now acts as commander in chief to decide on the next steps for the U.S. military in light of these twin explosions that have occurred around the Kabul airport.
Kimberly Halkett there with all the latest for us from the White House. Thanks so much, Kimberly. Well, speaking after those attacks, French President Emmanuel Macron has promised to continue working with the US to evacuate those trying to flee Afghanistan.
Il est évident que la tension monte beaucoup.
It is obvious that the tension is increasing greatly. We have all known the risk since the beginning, considering the confusion in Kabul and the tension that has been there since the beginning at the military airport. The next hours will remain extremely dangerous in Kabul and at the airport. The security situation is not under control, so we will keep with our allies, in particular our American allies, in a discussion which has been developing about the airport. We will do everything we can to evacuate French nationals and some Afghans.
Well, meanwhile, though, several countries have already wrapped up their evacuations, partly because of the security concerns. Germany, Hungary, the Netherlands, Belgium and Poland are all stopping their flights. Let's speak to Charlie Angela. She's in London. Charlie, despite other countries stopping their flights, it does seem that the UK, even after these blasts, is saying that they will continue with their evacuations?
Yes, Boris Johnson has just emerged from his emergency COBRA meeting with some good news for the people who are still on the ground. His conclusion is that the UK will be able to continue with its programme and timetable for evacuation. Remember, they had 11 flights planned to travel out of Kabul airport on Thursday. He said that the overwhelming majority of those eligible have already been evacuated and we're working on getting the rest of them through as quickly as possible. But he said, we also expect those who want to leave Afghanistan after phase 1, that's being before August 31st, will be allowed to do so by the Taliban, and they'll be putting pressure on them. But good news for the 1,000 Afghan interpreters who have been eligible for relocation, who have still not left the country. But just back to those two attacks, because the locations were very significant for the British. Abbey Gate was controlled by British troops, and the Baron Hotel was really a muster point for all British passport holders. So outside that hotel would have been some of these Afghan interpreters, also any people who are holding British passports hoping to get their visas processed for travel to the UK. Inside the hotel, British personnel who've been processing those visa applications. But there's been no UK personnel injured in those attacks, which would be good news for some. But some of those people who were injured might have been hoping to be relocated to the UK. Now, we heard there from President Emmanuel Macron. France is planning on ending its flights on Friday. But the president did say that there are still several hundred Afghans that he wants to help leave the country. 20 buses with a mixture of French and Afghan citizens on board are sitting outside the gates of Kabul airport at the moment. And the French are in discussions with the Taliban to allow them safe passage, but they have admitted that they might not be able to evacuate them safely. And there are very few countries left with any flights. As you said, that list of countries who've already stopped their evacuation flights, we can now add Norway to that list. They've just wrapped up their last flight, saying it's impossible to get anyone through the gates, so there's no point, and their last flight has left. However, NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said that the priority remains to evacuate as many people as possible. It's just not clear how that's going to happen. But one last point is that since those attacks, we do know there has been a little bit of aircraft movement. 2 C-17As, which are strategic airlift capability aircraft. These are huge NATO aircraft, have taken off. So it seems that some people or equipment are still leaving the base.
Charlie Angela there with all the latest for us from Europe and from London. Thank you, Charlie.
White House press secretary. Instead, they'll be looking to hear from the U.S. president. And that we have no confirmation of any sort of appearance by the U.S. president. Now, that is not completely unusual, given the fact that things are still changing rapidly on the ground. It's very hard for someone to respond when they don't have the complete facts in any situation, and that includes the U.S. president as commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. So, as you pointed out, the Situation Room is where he is getting those classified briefings. That earlier in the day, we know he was joined by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as well as the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, and General Milley, and others as well, in coordination with the commanders on the ground. So this is the setting where the president will continue to get his updates. And we are still waiting for some clarification about when the U.S. president may potentially speak to the press or to the American public at large. Now, he had been scheduled to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister today. Naftali Bennett was scheduled to discuss a number of agenda items with the U.S. President. Afghanistan was to be one of those topics, but the Israeli media, for its part, has mostly left the White House campus now, given the fact that that meeting was delayed, and I would be highly surprised if it was held today, maybe pushed off until tomorrow. It is not clear. So much has been changing as a result of these developing events, and so we are continuing to monitor them very carefully to see what might happen next.
Of course, and Kimberly, President Biden's been under a huge amount of pressure, receiving criticism from both sides of the aisle there in Washington. Do the deaths that we've seen in Kabul, especially those of U.S. servicemen and women, do they change the political calculus for him going forward?
Well, certainly there has been an outpouring of condolences coming from members of Congress at minimum. And there is very strong emotion coming from some of the president's critics that include even members of his own Democratic Party in some cases. Not surprisingly, the president's Republican critics have come down very hard on the U.S. president. Many had been articulating that this was their greatest fear, a loss of life. And now we are seeing that. And so this is opening the president up to not only criticism, but also some difficult decisions, maybe the ultimate test of his presidency thus far in terms of what he should do next as the U.S. commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. Should he hold firm on that August 31st withdrawal date that he has stuck to so far, or whether, at the advice of the international community as well as members of Congress, he should delay it and allow for evacuations to continue. So this is what we're waiting to hear from the president. But in the meantime, his critics are accusing him of having blood on his hands. And one senior senator, a Democratic senator, is also highly critical of the Taliban. And I know we've been talking about how the Taliban has said that this has occurred in an area that the U.S. was in control of outside of Kabul airport. But this top senator on the Foreign Relations Committee seems to be suggesting otherwise. In his statement, he not only condemns the attacks, but blames the Taliban for them occurring. He says, as we wait for more details, one thing is clear: we can't trust the Taliban with American security. This is a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. So there are certainly criticisms coming from both the left of the political spectrum as well as the right. And the pressure on Joe Biden is enormous right now in terms of next steps. Does he go with a contingency plan that has been drawn up by the Pentagon, or does he stick to his original deadline? He had been holding firm on that August 31st deadline because he said with each additional day into September that American troops are there, there is increased risk that we've seen play out, sadly, with the result being at least 4 Americans killed, and that number potentially could climb higher.
Indeed. Kimberly Halkett there with all the latest from the White House. Thank you, Kimberly. Well, let's now move over to New York and speak to Mike Hanna. He's at the United Nations for us. Mike, I believe that the Secretary General is now trying to organize an emergency meeting on Afghanistan. What do we know about that?
Well, there's a number of things happening at the moment. Obviously, discussions going on among diplomats. There was a previously scheduled Security Council meeting, which is due to begin in just under an hour. That's on an unrelated issue, the issue of Ethiopia and Tigray. What we do understand at this point is that the Secretary General has convened a meeting of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. But this is only going to take place on Monday, we understand. There are moves, we also understand, to get a security statement, Security Council statement out on this crisis in Afghanistan and on the killings there. We did have a statement from the spokesman for the Secretary General earlier on this morning. He condemned the attack. He also offered his condolences to the families of those killed. And the statement from the spokesman continued, this incident underscores the volatility of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, but also strengthens our resolve as we continue to deliver urgent assistance across the country in support of the Afghan people. The UN making clear it intends, as far as possible, to continue its operations within Afghanistan, the present attacks and the threat of further ones notwithstanding. But as I said, discussions going on behind closed doors at the moment among diplomats. We do expect a statement from the Security Council at some stage. The question is when. And we do know that there will be a meeting on Monday convened by the Secretary General with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
Mike Hanna there with all the latest on all those happenings for us at the United Nations. Thank you, Mike. Well, meanwhile, former Afghan Chief Executive Abdullah Abdullah has issued a statement saying, "I strongly condemn the terrorist attack at Kabul airport, which killed and wounded a large number of civilians. My thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families at this difficult time." Well, witnesses to those attacks have been describing what they saw when those explosions went off.
It was time for the evening prayer when an explosion happened. I saw about 70 vehicles carried around 150 injured to the hospital.
People were standing at the airport gate for evacuation when the blast happened. My cousin was also wounded on his leg, so he brought him to the hospital.
Well, let's speak to Bilal Sarwari. He's an independent Afghan journalist. He joins us now from here in Doha. Bilal, thank you for taking the time to be with us. I'm guessing that you're not hugely surprised at what we've seen today in Kabul.
I was speaking to several of my friends who had taken their family members, and they were trying to get their, documents approved and vetted so that they could get inside the airport, when suddenly one of my friends texted me saying that there had been an explosion inside a very large, crowd of people. And I haven't been able to get in touch with some of my friends and their family members, so I have my own concerns and fears. But this is an attack that took place, in the middle of hundreds of people. There's the sewage canal through which Afghans were going, to be vetted. And as you can see, the conditions at the Hamid Karzai International Airport has been very, very bad, whether you talk about gunfire resulting in the death of Afghans or stampede killing young girls and civilians. But this attack is a massacre, of civilians. And I'm afraid the number of, victims, at least now that I've been told, is at least 40 Afghans were killed, mostly civilians. At least 150 Afghans were wounded. I was speaking to an official at the health ministry who said that several hospitals had received, a number of wounded, including those in critical conditions. And this is, after all, an attack against a very soft target, against vulnerable Afghans. But it is also true that everything in Afghanistan has crumbled. State institutions are gone. In the many years that I've been covering Afghanistan, it was the Crisis Response Unit, CRU, the Police Special Forces, who would have been fighting this type of attack. It would have been the Afghan intelligence and special forces carrying raids across many different neighborhoods in Kabul to prevent something like this from happening. And today, there is a clear vacuum. So for the Taliban, the challenge is, how can they keep Kabul functional? How can they police Kabul? How can they make sure that such attacks are prevented? And they are, at the moment, struggling to transition from what they were fighting across Afghanistan. Now they have to govern. All the mid-level security and police officials are gone. There was a company, I remember, that was tasked with providing security at the Hamid Karzai International Airport. That is gone, Scanners worth millions of dollars were purchased. So, commercial airlines, Turkish Airlines, Emirates, and Fly Dubai and others could fly into Kabul. So it does look, quite painful when you talk about the human side of it, the tragedy, the children getting killed. Now, looking into a video where all of these victims are inside that sewage canal, with all the dirt and the water, and it is pure humiliation.
Bilal, I'm so sorry to be hearing about the reports as well that you're hearing from your friends there. I'm curious about the conversations that you're having, because obviously there were warnings that an attack could take place. People were warned to stay away from that airport area, and yet people, hundreds, potentially thousands of people, still kept showing up. Is that a reflection of the level of desperation that currently exists in terms of trying to get out of the country?
It is actually. As a matter of fact, this is exactly what they were discussing, because the word about the threat had gone, among the people there, and they said that there's fear. My friend that I managed to speak to before he lost, his phone, perhaps he ran out of battery, he told me that people had suspected that there was someone suspicious going around. And at that moment, when people tried to confront this one attacker, he detonated a suicide vest. I mean, the Taliban for years, for example, carried these sort of attacks. And now they have to make sure that they prevent such attacks from taking place. But, what is even more tragic with an attack like this, that I've seen, U.S. soldiers and soldiers from other countries working round the clock, making sure, that Afghans could get through to the airport and onto the planes to leave. And when you hear, some eyewitnesses and some Taliban officials and other sources confirm to you that U.S. Service members are among those killed, a number of fatalities, at least is what I'm being told. It is heartbreaking on every single level.
Bilal, I understand that you yourself, you're currently in Doha, but you haven't been here very long. You yourself left Afghanistan. Can I ask you why?
Well, obviously, the environment is not conducive. I have had Taliban turning up at my gate. It's something that they've been doing to a lot of people. And I took that painful decision of leaving, despite the fact that I've studied in the West, I've been a frequent traveler, and I've always been fascinated by my own country and being committed to tell the story of the people of Afghanistan. But I had to take that decision in the interest of my family and our young daughter. She's almost 50 days old. We named her Sola, which means peace. A few weeks before Afghanistan experienced this turmoil, she was born. So, it was a painful decision, burying all of my dreams, leaving behind my friends, my city, my home. It is never, I think, an easy decision for any Afghan.
Bilal Sarwari there, an independent Afghan journalist, speaking to us here in Doha. Thank you so much for your time, sir, and thank you for joining us on Al Jazeera. Well, speaking after those attacks, French President Emmanuel Macron promised to continue working with the United States to evacuate those who are trying to flee Afghanistan.
Il est évident que la tension monte beaucoup.
It is obvious that the tension is increasing greatly. We have all known the risk since the beginning, considering the confusion in Kabul and the tension that has been there since the beginning at the military airport. The next hours will remain extremely dangerous in Kabul and at the airport. The security situation is not under control, so we will keep with our allies, in particular our American allies, in a discussion which has been developing about the airport. We will do everything we can to evacuate French nationals and some Afghans.
Well, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has described those attacks as horrendous.
Wir kennen noch nicht alle Einzelheiten, aber
we don't know all the details, but the terrorists were targeting people waiting outside the airport gates hoping to leave. They want security and freedom for themselves, and therefore this is an absolutely horrendous attack in a very, very tense situation. And my thoughts are with the victims and their families.
Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is saying that evacuations will continue despite those explosions near the Kabul airport.
There's been a barbaric terrorist attack, what looks like a series of attacks in Kabul on the airport, on the crowds at the airport, in which members of the US military, very sadly, have lost their lives, and many Afghan casualties as well. And we extend our condolences both to the United States of America and to the people of Afghanistan. And I want to stress that this threat of a terrorist attack is one of the constraints that we've been operating under in Operation Pitting, in the big extraction that's been going on, and we've been ready for it, we've been prepared for it, and I want to stress that we're going to continue with that operation, and we're now coming towards the end of it, to the very end of it, in any event, and we've already extracted the overwhelming majority of those under both schemes, the eligible persons, the UK persons, UK nationals, plus the Afghans, the interpreters, and others. And it's been a totally phenomenal effort by the UK. There's been nothing like it for decades and decades. But clearly, what this attack shows is the importance of continuing that work in as fast and as efficient a manner as possible in the hours that remain to us, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, several countries, meanwhile, have already wrapped up their evacuations, partly because of the security concerns there in Afghanistan. Germany, Hungary, the Netherlands, Belgium and Poland are all stopping their flights. Let's speak to Charlie Angela. She's across all of this for us from London. Charlie, I believe something like 11 British military flights were planned for Thursday, and so those now and others are potentially set to continue after hearing there from Prime Minister Johnson?
Yes, that'll be some very welcome news for Afghans on the ground who are earmarked for relocation to the UK. The fact that the UK's evacuation programme and timetable will not be changed by these attacks, and that's because the UK had put in place contingency plans. They were expecting these attacks, they'd had the intelligence, they knew that they were possibly imminent, and unfortunately they were right. But 11 flights evacuating people today, and maybe even some on Friday. The UK hasn't been clear on when it will have its last evacuation flight. It says it doesn't want to give a final deadline just in case it creates a stampede at the gates at the airport. But we do know that there is about 1,000 Afghan interpreters or people who worked with the British government who are eligible for relocation still to leave the country. But earlier, the UK Armed Forces Minister did say that because of the tension around the airport, those who hadn't been earmarked for relocation should find another way for safe passage out of the country, and that could be across a border crossing. But yes, good news for UK people who want to relocate. Not such good news for those other countries who've already wrapped up their evacuation flights, including Norway, who've just said that they cannot get any more people through the gate into the airport, so they've had to have their last flight out.
Charlie Angela there with all the latest from Europe for us from London. Thank you very much, Charlie. Well, earlier I spoke to Rosella Mikio. She was the president of Emergency, a medical NGO that's treating victims of the blast at their hospital in Kabul. And she explained to me that her organization is prepared to treat even more patients.
Well, at her seeing the usual disaster of war, we have received more than 60 patients now and 6 dead on arrival. So the impact of this blast has been huge. All of them civilians, and they keep coming. So we don't know exactly how big will be the number, the influx of patients. We work there since 22 years, and we have faced a mass casualty. So we do have plans, we do have extra beds. The hospital was 80% full, but we're adding beds on top of what we already had. Then, of course, once we do the triage, we will keep the more severe cases, the life-threatening conditions, and we'll try to refer the less severe cases, even though in these days there are not so many hospitals fully working in Kabul, unfortunately. It did not change. Our admission criteria just slightly open to also road traffic accidents, civilian traumas, because we started to receive in the last couple of weeks a reduced number of war wounded or war injuries. But generally speaking, we have been keeping both the 3 hospitals and the 40 clinics always up and running. All our staff is coming, both male and female, has been able to come far. So we hope to be able to continue our work also in the future. Well, to protect, not really. To get ready is what we try to do. Our hospital's been there for a very long time, and they've been assisting everybody, regardless their political affiliation. So it is our neutrality has been, let's say, our insurance since the very beginning, and so far it has been always respected. So what we do when we hear about these kind of threats is try and understand how to get ready inside the hospital to receive the massive influx of patients as we are seeing today. We have been in contact with the new, let's say, authorities in Kabul. They hosted also a health cluster meeting to introduce the focal points. But so far, we didn't have any, let's say, interference or any special request. We have been able to keep on doing our job as regularly as we did before. None of them has been taken to our hospital because we take everybody, so not only civilians but also combatants. But at the moment, as far as we know, all the injured patients referred to our hospitals are civilians. Some others, because I think that there are more than this, might have been taken to other facilities. They are very complex injuries because shells and the fragments they produce multiple injuries. So we receive people with multiple traumas, legs, arms, face, belly. Particularly serious are the vascular injuries because they can lead to a very sudden death. So in this moment, what is very important is to do a very good triage. And of course, the triage has to go on and on continuously because the patients have to be reevaluated. So it's definitely a very stressful moment for the hospital staff.
Well, Patrick Cockburn is a columnist at the Independent newspaper and also the author of several books, including The Rise of Islamic State. Now, there has been no claim of responsibility yet for those Kabul blasts, but he says that ISIL does aim to use high-profile attacks to try to dominate the global news agenda.
Obviously, people are extremely vulnerable. They're packed together. There are lots of sort of strange vehicles turning up. So it wouldn't be that difficult to do with minimum expertise. Of course, we don't know exactly who did it yet, but it's not too surprising. Bear in mind also that ISIL likes to top the news agenda. When there's something like this in front of all the television cameras, that's when it likes to stage atrocities like this to show that it's still a player, get people talking about it. That's really been the pattern in the last few years. What has happened with the fall of Kabul makes life easier for ISIL with prisoners being released. But even so, it wouldn't take many people to stage an attack like we've seen this morning against such a vulnerable target. From the Taliban's point of view, yes, I mean, I think that they'll want to show that they're in control. That's important for them because they're looking for international recognition as the new government. They will also probably see an advantage to them of ISIL being the new bogeyman in international bogeyman in Afghanistan rather than the Taliban. Of course, the original Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was the size of Great Britain. It was an enormous territorial entity, but it was also made itself a target that anybody could attack. ISIL now is behaving much more like sort of Al-Qaeda did in the past, that you have a cell structure and you launch sort of intermittent attacks, but very high-profile ones, usually against very soft targets, but ones that ensure that everybody knows that you're about. It doesn't matter if, from their point of view, I think people denounce them or because that shows they're there, it brings in recruits, it brings in money.
Well, let's bring in Marwan Bashara. He's Al Jazeera's senior political analyst and joins us now from Paris. Marwan, I was really interested by what Patrick was saying there about potentially trying to change the narrative about who the villain is here. I mean, the Taliban does appear to be trying to make some political hay, so to speak, out of these attacks that we've seen today.
Oh, absolutely. I think the Taliban would be more than happy to see all animosity and hatred and mobilization against ISIL rather than against the Taliban. So I think to have this sort of operation used to project the Western hatred towards ISIL is a good thing for the Taliban. I mean, you know, if it's between two extremes, the Taliban will look like the less extreme. But, you know, of course, we all bear in mind that during war, especially in Afghanistan, what we saw over the last 20 years is the Taliban is more than capable to do whatever it takes to win, just like all the other groups, just like the United States as well. ISIL proves to be unique in its viciousness. It sort of celebrates it, it boasts it, and it thinks that it's one of its best assets. And the more popularity, you know, the more infamous it becomes, the more it thinks this helps its cause, unfortunately.
Marwan, I'm curious because, by my understanding, ISIL-K, and obviously there has been no actual claim of responsibility as of yet, but ISIL-K is made up somewhat of defectors from the Taliban. Now, if the Taliban is trying to portray itself as some kind of legitimate government, is there a concern then that as other groups try to assert their power, that might expose more divisions within the Taliban itself?
Yes, I mean, the reports that we've seen, and we don't have all the information, is that some of the younger generation amongst the Taliban joined Daesh in Afghanistan, but not in great numbers. You know, unlike the Taliban, which counts in, you know, 70, 80,000 fighters, ISIL works in smaller groups, more radicalized individuals, and so on and so forth. So I think clearly ISIL would become a boogeyman, as we just heard earlier, but it also become a nuisance for Taliban moving forward. And hence the idea of stabilizing Afghanistan is going to be a challenge for the Taliban. It's not an existential challenge, but it is a challenge nonetheless to be able to unite and stabilize the country with so many factions and so many tribal and ethnic groups in the country being impoverished and all. It's really, you know, a daunting task. And that will require, you know, huge support by neighboring countries and by the international community. Otherwise, what we will see is a major strategic void, chaos in Afghanistan, and then that will invite neighboring countries to interfere or to intervene in a way that will, you know, spiral out of control.
Marwan, I was just speaking to an Afghan journalist who fled Kabul, who was saying that he feels that this is happening because there is this security vacuum currently taking place in Kabul. Do you think that the Taliban actually has the capacity to govern at the moment? Can they go from being a fighting insurgent movement to actually being a government?
Actually, one of the more interesting stories I've heard from journalists, Afghan journalists on the ground, is the idea that there are two Kabuls now. There's the Kabul of the airport and there's the rest of the city. And that, in fact, Taliban has been able to neutralize, stabilize the rest of the city. And the big mess is happening in the airport and its surroundings because of the idea of the evacuation and the presence of the American troops and so on and so forth. So in as far as we know, you know, the Taliban has been quite a formidable force that was able to stabilize, neutralize to a large degree, you know, Kabul and part of the country. I think the idea of the airport, I think, presents a different challenge, a different threat for the Taliban, which is the idea that so many people want to flee, and not just any people, the professionals, the judges and the lawyers and the doctors and the engineers and so on and so forth, which means that will create a brain drain in the country, and that will make it even harder for the Taliban to be able to manage the affairs of the country.
Marwan, given that we have seen what's happened today and the Taliban is trying to portray this narrative as being these attacks only took place because of the presence of foreign forces, which you're alluding to there about that mess around the airport, does this change the calculus for the United States, especially now that we've actually also seen escalating troop deaths?
Well, look, I mean, just, you know, if we just take a bit of a a helicopter or even a 35,000 feet view, a historical view of what is unraveling, this dramatic unraveling in Afghanistan. Clearly, this is the result of the most stupid idea of the past 1,000 years, the idea of a military crusade to transform the Muslim world. And we've seen that unravel in Iraq, and now we've seen it unravel in Afghanistan, and we're probably going to continue to see it unraveling elsewhere. So the idea of this military crusade to change and transform the Muslim world is unraveling today. And hence we see it and we report it in many different ways, because there's the humanitarian situation, there is the explosions, the terror, and so on and so forth. But let's not lose sight that this is the result, the culmination of 20 years of mistakes, 20 years of lies. What we hope, what we aspire, all of us, Afghans and others, is that some lessons are being learned, and that moving forward will mean some of what President Biden is saying, which is we are no longer going to get involved in wars in the Middle East. We're no longer going to deploy troops to the Middle East to fight on behalf of other people who won't even fight for themselves. And clearly, if there is issue with terror, that it will be handled through intelligence, capital I and small I, all sorts of intelligence, but as well as development, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. So clearly there's lots of lessons to be learned. None of them, of course, are going to be discussed today or by August 31st, because what we have today is an emergency situation, and everyone is trying to deal with the moment. And we, as media, of course, must focus on the moment as well, but never lose sight of the bigger picture.
Marwan, we've been talking a lot about the US and Western allies and their approach to all of this, as well as these evacuations. How do you think other big global powers, especially those with big strategic interests in Afghanistan and that region, are looking at what's playing out today? Are leaders in Moscow and Beijing very worried about what they're seeing in Kabul right now? They've been notoriously silent today.
I think they're worried and they're laughing at the same time. It's quite paradoxical, as it were. You know, it's not easy to inherit something like Afghanistan. So I'm not sure China or Russia or even other countries are going to be interested to simply just march forward and replace the United States. We've already seen Russia and Syria, and it's almost starting to regret being there, because it's not easy to be a foreign force in a country that's falling apart. That's basically a failed state. And Afghanistan could become a failed state. What the Chinese and the Russians and some others might be happy about is that America is humiliated. And of course, we all know that President Biden considered the main challenge for the United States in the 21st century is China. This is the strategic challenge. And if there's any moves nowadays outside the Middle East, it's because they're trying to focus on Asia. And that's what Vice President Kamala Harris is doing in Vietnam, trying to say is that, look, in Southeast Asia, it's not going to be like in Central Asia or the Middle East. We will stay here. I mean, because everyone now is worried that as the Americans leave their allies and leave the Middle East, they might just as well leave the Philippines and Indonesia and Japan and South Korea and so on and so forth. So these are some of the major concerns. And I think China looks at this with a strategic eye. It looks at these crises and it sees opportunity. And the opportunity is to emphasize and expand on its Belt and Road initiative, which takes it through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, the Gulf, and so on and so forth. And Afghanistan will be an important part of the chain because, as we were discussing earlier, it's rich in minerals, and China needs those minerals. In fact, some of the reports tell us that there's some $2 to $3 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan that only wait to be mined, if you will. But that will take stability, that will take investment, that will take governance, and so on and so forth. So no one is going to step forward and benefit from this crisis too soon. But clearly, people are looking at this as an opportunity. On the other hand, and quickly, just to say that clearly a lot of people are just now glimpsed at the Economist cover talking about global jihad. So clearly, there's a sense that what's happening in Afghanistan, the success of the Taliban, will be inspiring jihadi groups across the world, especially in Asia. And that will present a problem to China and Russia, both of which have major Muslim communities and are surrounded, or not surrounded, neighboring some Muslim countries. So that will be a strategic issue, challenge for Russia and China, just as it is for the United States and others.
Marwan Bashara there, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, speaking to us from Paris. Great to get your thoughts again. Thanks for being with us, Marwan. Well, let's remind you of what's happened today. At least 60 people have now been killed, according to medical sources, in 2 explosions outside Kabul airport. The United States now says 12 of its troops have died, according to the Associated Press and Reuters news agencies. And a 3rd explosion has just been heard over the past hour. This all comes after the United States, Australia and the UK warned people to stay away because of what they called an imminent threat from an ISIL offshoot in the country. Thousands have been gathering outside the airport now for days in hopes of fleeing the country after the Taliban took over. Well, Al Jazeera's Charlotte Bellis has been in Kabul, and she headed for the airport very soon after the attack and described what she saw.
We initially heard the first explosion around 5:40 p.m. We headed towards the scene and there was chaos, as you can imagine. There was a lot of gunfire as the Taliban tried to push people away and control the scene. We tried to move closer towards Abbey Gate. We heard another explosion. There was more heavy gunfire. There was hundreds of people running towards us, and there was heavy smoke in the air. We heard sirens coming from the airport, and the Taliban fighters that guard that south gate where we had arrived were pushing everyone back quite frantically. They were panicked themselves. A few ambulances drove past us, and we stayed there for about half an hour, and heavy gunfire continued throughout. We've tried to talk to US military forces over this time, but they are keeping quite quiet about their operations. But we do know that 3 US soldiers were injured, and I was just down there earlier this week at this exact location at Abbey Gate. And the Taliban don't let you film around the airport's perimeter, so I used my phone to film and capture some of what was happening. There were hundreds of people around Abbey Gate. This was just a couple of days ago. There were Taliban checkpoints around there, and then there's a post with 3 Americans in it at that time that were overlooking the scene at the top of about a 3-meter high concrete wall surrounded by barbed wire, and they were overlooking the hundreds of people trying to get through. People below them were waving pieces of paper saying, you know, I deserve to get on some of these flights. Here's my certificate from working with the Americans and what have you. And they had the gate closed at that time, just overlooking the scene. We heard of an ISIL threat earlier this week. It didn't seem to deter anybody, but then it was only coming from the US and it was quite vague. Over the last 24 hours or so, there were more threats issued by various countries talking about this ISIL threat. I contacted the Taliban this morning to ask if they knew any more details about, have any more intelligence on it. They said, from what we understand, ISIL is planning some type of car bombing in and around the airport, and that they're looking for maximum damage. After we received that, we decided to stay clear of the airport today, as did other media networks who we had been going down there, all of us, every day, but today most people steered clear because there was the threats level, and the amount of information we were getting was getting more credible and coming from more sources. And it was more kind of watch and wait. I do have to say that my producer ducked down there briefly just to have a quick look from a distance, and he said there were far fewer people down there today, that the Taliban were incredibly tense, and that's saying something because they've been tense all week, but very much pushing people back, trying to keep them at a distance from the airport, and were quite agitated when he got down there and they told him to leave immediately. So everyone was on alert today, but at Abbey Gate it appears that there had been crowds forming and that they hadn't managed to disperse them when this explosion occurred.
Well, those twin attacks happened as large crowds, as Charlotte was saying there, tried to reach Kabul airport in order to have a chance of boarding a flight out of Afghanistan. The first attack was a suicide bomb. It struck the airport's Abbey Gate. Crowds do still appear to be ignoring warnings to stay away. And then another attack took place at the Baron Hotel. People hoping to be evacuated had also been congregating there too. Well, meanwhile, Canada and several European nations now say they've wrapped up their evacuations in Afghanistan. Germany, Belgium, Denmark and the Netherlands say their operation is complete, while France now says its last plane will leave on Friday. Many are worried about the deteriorating security situation there ahead of the August 31st deadline set by the US and the Taliban to withdraw all foreign troops. Well, earlier I spoke to David Desroches. He's a professor at the National Defense University here in Qatar and is also a former Pentagon director of Arabian Peninsula Affairs. And he told me it was always going to be difficult to prevent an attack around Kabul airport.
The attack wasn't in a heavily secured area. That's exactly the problem. So normally soldiers are trained to operate at a distance from civilians and basically push civilians away. When you have a situation like this where you have meritorious and desperate civilians who, you can't disperse with threats or gunfire. They're desperate. They're sympathetic. It's a pretty simple matter for any determined enemy, whether it's the Taliban or ISIS or whomever, to infiltrate this body and carry out an attack. The soldiers don't have any control over anything beyond their perimeter, and it looks as though the Taliban doesn't either. So it's a difficult situation for the soldiers and pretty easy for the attacker. There's a lot of nightmare concerns here. I mean, one of the problems is that, you're dealing with a large number of desperate people who do not behave as rational people. They don't know when, whether the next plane to lift off is the last plane. And so if you're a soldier where you want to say, okay, everybody space out, let's look at you, they're not going to follow that. They're going to come rushing. Because for them, it's literally a matter of life or death. And the problem is the soldiers, when they see people coming at them, now that there's been a suicide bomb, they don't know if these people are suicide bombers as well. So it's very, very hard for soldiers. There's the possibility of shooting people you don't want to shoot. There's a possibility of unfriendly engagements. There's a possibility of additional attacks. It takes a bad situation. This attack, which is in violation of any custom of warfare, takes a bad situation and makes it much, much worse. If you had the ability to take all the people seeking to enter the airport and say, right, everybody, you're at a 10-meter interval, let us see you, stop, get out. But the reports I'm seeing, the pictures I'm seeing are just of a massive humanity. And nobody wants to be at the back of the line because you might be left holding the bag. So it's very, very hard. And there's a lot of people who have a motivation to carry this out, not just ISIL-K, the Taliban themselves, which is a very undisciplined organization. There could be elements within them who did this. So we don't know a lot of things right now. We only know that there's a bad situation became much, much more dangerous.
Well, that is it from me, Nastasia Tay, here in Doha. But I'll hand you over to Miriam Namazi in London, who'll have more special coverage of the Afghan attacks. Stay with us.
On air or online, be part of the debate.
For Pacific people, the ocean is our identity and the source of well-being. We are the ocean.
When no topic is off the table.
It's a shoot-inside atmosphere.
People are demoralized, they're exhausted, and many healthcare workers are experiencing PTSD-like symptoms.
Jump into the stream and join our global community.
If you're online on YouTube right now, you can be part of this conversation as well.
The stream on Al Jazeera.
For the Ramirez and Remolina families, the pain is unbearable. 4 of their relatives were killed last week during a military operation ordered by the Venezuelan government. Security forces accused them of being part of a Colombian rebel group and said they died in combat. But neighbors and family members insist they were innocent, taken from their homes and executed. Under pressure, Venezuela's Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino said the armed forces were obliged to defend the country from irregular groups, but added that human rights needed to be respected and that the events at the border would be investigated.
Think of some of the biggest companies in the world today. All of them big tech with algorithms at their core. The more that we use them, the more data we produce. We're in the midst of a great race for data, and big tech companies are on the chase.
Empires are rising on a wealth of information, and we are the commodity. In the second of a 5-part series, Ali Ray examines whether corporations are colonizing the internet. Like Me, the popularity and power of big tech on Al Jazeera.
We understand the differences and similarities of cultures across the world. So no matter what moves you, Al Jazeera will bring you the news and current affairs that matter to you. Al Jazeera,
Hello, I'm Mariam Namazi. You're watching Al Jazeera live from London with our ongoing coverage of the breaking news story from Afghanistan this hour, where as many as 60 people are reported dead after a double bomb attack outside Kabul airport, where thousands were gathered hoping to escape. Among the dead, a number of children and according to the Reuters news agencies, they're reporting that 11 US Marines have also died along with a Navy medic. The US and UK continuing to airlift people out of the country, but several other countries have stopped their evacuations early. Well, of course, we're focusing on Afghanistan this hour, where the Taliban says at least 13 people have been killed in two explosions outside Kabul's international airport. But medical sources have told Al Jazeera as many as 60 people have been killed in the attack. Pentagon is speaking about these latest developments, so let's listen in.
Fighters detonated in the vicinity of the Abbey Gate at Hamad Karzai International Airport and in the vicinity of the Baron Hotel, which is immediately adjacent. The attack on the Abbey Gate was followed by a number of ISIS gunmen who opened fire on civilians and military forces. At this time, we know that 12 U.S. service members have been killed in the attack, and 15 more service members have been injured. A number of Afghan civilians were also killed and injured in the attack. We are treating some of them aboard HKIA. Many other Afghan civilians have been taken out to hospitals in town. We're still working to calculate the total losses. We just don't know what that is right now. Their loss weighs heavily on us all, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through my prepared remarks. We continue to focus on the protection of our forces and the evacuees as the evacuation continues. Let me be clear, while we're saddened by the loss of life, both U.S. and Afghan, we're continuing to execute the mission. Our mission is to evacuate U.S. citizens, third country nationals, special immigrant visa holders, U.S. Embassy staff, and Afghans at risk. Despite this attack, we are continuing the mission. The evacuation at best speed, and as of today, we have approximately 5,000 evacuees on the ramp at HKIA awaiting airlift. Since August the 14th, we've evacuated more than 104,000 civilians from HKIA, over 66,000 by the United States, and over 37,000 by our allies and partners. And that includes bringing out about 5,000 Americans. As the Secretary of State said yesterday, we believe that there are about 1,000, probably a little more than 1,000 American citizens left in Afghanistan at this point. We're doing everything we can in concert with our Department of State partners to reach out to them and to help them leave, if they want to leave. And remember, not everybody wants to leave. Yesterday, we brought in over 500 American citizens. It would be difficult to overestimate the number of unusual challenges and competing demands that our forces on the ground have faced. The threat to our forces, particularly from ISIS-K, is very real, as we have seen today. I would also like to express the sense of profound pride I have in the creative, determined, and professional way that our forces have overcome those challenges and to deliver the results that we talked about in my opening portion of the remarks, the number of people that we've been able to extract from Afghanistan. It would also be remiss of me not to mention the tremendous contributions of our many coalition partners, and they stood with us on the ground at HKIA, and also the interagency and international partners who supported the evacuation. The many soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen who supported this operation downrange across the Central Command, the European Command, and the Northern Command areas of responsibility. Moreover, this evacuation could simply not have been done without the amazing flexibility of U.S. Transportation Command and the airlift provided by the United States Air Force. No other military in the world has anything like it. I'd also like to thank the host nations that have generously provided access to their facilities for the processing, the care, and the feeding of our evacuees. I also need to acknowledge the temporary suffering that some of our evacuees have had to endure. Please know that we continue to execute our number one mission, which is to get as many American citizens and other evacuees as possible out of Afghanistan. We also continue to expand the capacity at our intermediate facilities to ensure safe, sanitary, and humane conditions for our evacuees, while continuing to look for ultimate ways to expedite their processing and ultimate transfer to the United States or other destinations. I'd like to close out my remarks today by just taking a moment to describe the heroism that our Marines, soldiers, and sailors are exhibiting as they screen the people who are coming onto the airfield. This is close-up work. The breath of the person you are searching is upon you. While we have overwatch in place, we still have to touch the clothes of the person that's coming in. I think you all can appreciate the courage and the dedication that is necessary to do this job and to do it time after time. Please remember that we have screened over 104,000 people. Finally, I'd like to offer my profound condolences to the families of our servicemen and women and Afghan civilians who lost their lives today. We have put more than 5,000 U.S. service members at risk to save as many civilians as we can. It's a noble mission, and today we have seen firsthand how dangerous that mission is. ISIS will not deter us from accomplishing the mission, I can assure you of that. All Americans can and should be proud of the men and women of the armed forces who are facing these dangers head on, with their international partners and all our other friends that are with us. And we appreciate your thoughts and prayers for all our service members who are carrying on this mission today. John, I'm now ready to take questions.
Thank you, General. We'll start with Lita.
Thank you. General McKenzie, Lita Baldor with AP, thank you for taking the time to do this. Can you give us your assessment of the ISIS threat going forward? What are you seeing on the ground now? Does this cut the evacuation short, do you believe? And are people able to get onto the airport now? And then finally, the president has warned that any attacks against the U.S. would be answered. Will this attack be answered militarily by the U.S.?
So a number of questions there. Let me try to take them in order. So first of all, the threat from ISIS is extremely real. We've been talking about this for several days. We saw it actually manifest itself here in the last few hours with an actual attack. We believe it is their desire to continue those attacks, and we expect those attacks to continue. And we're doing everything we can to be prepared for those attacks. That includes reaching out to the Taliban, who are actually providing the outer security cordon around the airfield, to make sure they know what we expect them to do to protect us. And we will continue to coordinate with them as they go forward. We are continuing to bring people onto the airfield. We just brought a number of buses aboard the airfield over the last couple of 3 hours. So we continue to process. We'll continue to flow people out. The plan is designed to operate while under stress and under attack, and we will continue to do that. We will coordinate very carefully to make sure that it's safe for American citizens to come to the airfield. If it's not, we'll tell them to hold, and then we'll work other ways to try to get them to the airfield. But I think our mission remains. We're still committed to flowing people out up until we terminate operations at some point, towards the end of the month. But I think we have the ability actually to do all of those things as we go forward. Let me just come back one moment. And you talked about going after ISIS. Yes, if we can find who's associated with this, we will go after them. We've been clear all along that we're going to retain the right to operate against ISIS in Afghanistan. And we are working very hard right now to determine attribution, to determine who is associated with this cowardly attack, and we're prepared to take action against them. 24/7, we are looking for them.
David.
General David Martin with CBS. 27 casualties is a terrible number. 12 dead. Could you explain the circumstances of these attacks which resulted in such high casualties for the U.S.?
Sure, David. So first of all, you will understand that we're still investigating the exact circumstances. But what I can tell you is this. The attack occurred at a gate. And at a gate, we have to check people before they get onto the airfield. We have to ensure they're not carrying a bomb or any other kind of weapon that could ultimately make its way onto an aircraft. So that requires physical screening. You can't do that with standoff. You ultimately have to get very close to that person. So while the air base itself is surrounded with T-walls, we're well bunkered in. We've done a variety of things to protect ourselves. At these interface points, these gates where people actually come on the airfield, there's no substitute for a young man or woman, a young United States man or woman, standing up there conducting a search of that person before we let them on. Now, the Taliban have conducted searches before they get to that point, and sometimes those searches have been good and sometimes not. I will simply note that before this attack, we had passed 104,000 people through. So this attack is one too many, but we'll evaluate what happened. We'll find ways to always get better. But the key thing is You don't want to let somebody on an airplane carrying a bomb because that could result in even massive loss of life if an airplane were to be destroyed. So you got to do the searches. We work with our Afghan partners on the ground, the NSU elements, to conduct those searches. But ultimately, Americans have got to be in danger to do these searches. There's really no other way to do it. And again, I cannot tell you how impressed I am with the daily heroism of the men and women that are out there doing this work. Typically soldiers, sailors, and Marines that are doing that work. And they're right up close to thousands of people that are flowing through the airfield. You've all seen the images. And to be able to get up and do it day after day, it's remarkable. And this time, it looks like somebody got close to us. We'll find out why. We'll try to improve our procedures. It is 12 service members dying. Nobody feels that more closely, more directly than me and everyone else in the chain of command. And we recognize that we need to continue to evaluate our procedures as we go forward. At the same time, there's a tension there. We have to continue to let people own the airfield because that is why we are there. We're not there to defend ourselves. We're there to defend ourselves while we process American citizens first, but also the other categories of people that I've mentioned, get them to a place where we can fly them out into a safer, better future.
So just to be clear, this suicide bomber was going through the gate, being searched, checked by U.S. service members when he detonated his vest?
David, that would be my working assumption. I know this, he did not get inside, he did not get on the installation. It was at the interface point where they try to come in where this attack occurred. And we just don't know more right now. We're gathering that information. As you will understand, we're investigating that. But right now, our focus really, we have other active threat streams, extremely active threat streams against the airfield. We want to make sure that we've taken the steps we need to take to protect ourselves there. So our focus is on that. Over the next few hours and a day or two, we'll learn a lot more about what happened here. And I'm sure we'll be able to share that with you. But right now, our focus is actually going forward, ensuring that another attack of this nature does not occur. Because as you know, typically the pattern is multiple attacks. And we want to be prepared and be ready to defend against that.
Courtney.
Can you, hey, General McKenzie, it's Courtney Cuby from NBC News. Can you tell us a little bit more about these extremely real additional threats from ISIS? Is it a concern about more suicide attacks? And also about some of the steps that you may be taking to mitigate future attacks? I mean, would it include putting U.S. troops or Marines outside the gates or outside of the airport for additional perimeter security? And then finally, with all of this, is there any discussion about sending any additional U.S. troops to Kabul airport for additional security measures?
So let me actually answer the last part of your question first. We assess we have the forces we need to protect ourselves there. I'm always in a constant dialogue with the secretary. If I needed anything else, I'd be talking to him immediately. But I think we have what we need to protect ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about the threat streams. So very, very real threat streams, very, very what we would call tactical. That means imminent, could occur at any moment. And they range from rocket attacks. We know that they would like to lob a rocket in there if they could. Now, we actually have pretty good protection against that. We have our anti-rocket and mortar system, the gun systems that those of you who've been out there are very familiar with, that are pretty effective against these kinds of attack. We are well positioned around the boundary of the airfield, and we feel that we would be in good shape should that kind of attack occur. We also know they aim to get a vehicle-borne suicide attack in if they can, from a small vehicle to a large vehicle. They're working all those options. And then we've just seen their ability to deliver a walk-in, a vest-wearing suicide attacker. All of those things we look at. Now, the other thing we do is we share versions of this information with the Taliban so that they can actually do some searching out there for us. And we believe that some attacks have been thwarted by them. Again, we've been doing this we've been doing this since the 14th. This is an attack that's been carried out. We believe it's possible that others have been thwarted. We cut down the information we give the Taliban. They don't get the full range of information we have, but we give them enough to act in time and space to try to prevent these attacks. The other thing we try to do is we try to push out the boundary even further so that we don't get large crowds massing at the gate. Clearly, at Abbey Gate today, we had a larger crowd there than we would like, which goes to show you that the system is not perfect. But we have gained large elements of standoff at other gates, and we want to keep that kind of standoff in place. As you know, standoff for attacks like this is always the best defense. Unfortunately, we just don't have the opportunity, given the geography of the ground that we're on, to always gain that kind of standoff. So let me close up your question by saying, we take the threat of these attacks very seriously. We're working them very hard. We're doing a variety of things. We got, as you know, we have AH-64 attack helicopters on the ground that we're flying to take a look. They have very good thermal and optical imaging systems. We got aircraft overhead that also have very good imaging systems. We have unmanned aircraft, MQ-9s, that have the ability to look. All of these systems are being applied in defense of the airfield, all of them on a continual basis, all of them vectored by the intelligence that we receive, and then we also use the Taliban as a tool to protect us as much as possible.
I'm going to go to the phones. I haven't done that yet. Alex Horton, Washington Post. Alex, you there?
Yep, just unmuting. Hey, General, this is Alex Horton with the Washington Post. Thanks for doing this. Can you give us a sense of where you are in casualty notification for these folks on the ground? How long you expect it to take, given that it's a large number? And also, can you tell us a little bit about, how the forces have reacted? You said that you introduced a little, probably more standoff at this point, but what are other measures you're taking to increase security after the attack?
Sure. So I would actually defer you to the services for notification of casualties. That's a function that the services provide. And I believe that process is ongoing, but I do not have visibility on it. My visibility is fully forward against the day-to-day practical threat that we face in the theater. But there are other people who can probably then answer that question for you. I'm just not that person, Alex. So in terms of practical things that we're doing, okay, again, we've reached out to the Taliban. We've told them you need to continue to push out the security perimeter. We've identified some roads that we would like for them to close. They've identified that they will be willing to close those roads because we assess the threat of a suicide-borne vehicle threat is high right now. So we want to reduce the possibility of one of those vehicles getting close. And so we're actually moving very aggressively to do that. We talked a little bit about the overwatch that we have in place, but I'll review it again. We have our unmanned aircraft, our MQ-9s, and other unmanned drone systems that have very good optical and other means of looking down. So we look at what's happening around the gate. We try to identify patterns, and we got highly trained people that take a look at that. We also have our aircraft that we fly locally, the AH-64s that I mentioned a few moments ago, as well as other manned aircraft that come off the USS, off the carrier that we have off the Makran coast, as well as U.S. Air Force aircraft that we bring up from out of Afghanistan. Everything ranging from F-15s to AC-130 gunships. And as you know, the AC-130 gunship has a very highly capable targeting system, and it's also a very visible platform. And we know from long experience that visible demonstration of these kinds of ISR tends to dissuade the attacker because they know that if we can see them do it, we're going to strike them immediately. So we'll be prepared to do that should it become necessary to defend the base. We're looking very hard. We assess we are in a period of heightened warning right now, and we're working through that as aggressively as we can. Over.
Gordon.
Yeah, General, Gordon Wolf from Wall Street Journal. Can you tell us if you think that your recommendation for staying potentially after August 31st would change because of this threat stream? Or are you concerned about the threat stream? And also, the U.S. military and the Taliban have been coordinating very closely on various things. Do you still trust the Taliban, and is it possible that they let this happen?
So as to whether or not they let it happen, I don't know. I don't think there's anything to convince me that they let it happen. As to whether or not I trust them, that's not necessarily that's a word I use very carefully. You've heard me say before, it's not what they say, it's what they do. They have a practical reason for wanting us to get out of here by the 31st of August, and that's that they want to reclaim the airfield. We want to get out by that day too, if it's going to be possible to do so. So we share a common purpose. As long as we've kept that common purpose aligned, they've been useful to work with. They've cut some of our security concerns down, and they've been useful to work with going forward. Now, long term, I don't know what that's going to be. I will tell you this: anytime you build a non-combatant evacuation plan like this, and you bring in forces, you expect to be attacked. So we expect, we thought this would happen sooner or later. It's tragic that it happened today. It's tragic there was this much loss of life. We are prepared to continue the mission. I've had a great opportunity to have dialogue with my chain of command on it, and I'm not going to be able to share with you what my advice has been, as you know and understand, Gordon. But I think we can continue to conduct our mission even while we're receiving attacks like this. Over.
Eric.
General Eric Schmidt with the New York Times. Even before today's attack, you were just 4 days or so from leaving. How soon will you have to start diminishing the evacuation flights, if indeed those can continue, to make space and time for the military retrograde, that is the withdrawal of the remaining troops there and their equipment?
So, Eric, without getting into specifics, I would tell you that the plan is designed to maximize throughput of evacuees even as we begin to prepare to draw down the force on the ground. So we recognize there's a need to balance the two. So we're not going to get to a point where suddenly we turn off the spigot. It will draw down as we get closer to the end date. It's not useful for me to share that date with you right now when we will begin to draw down those flights, but we will do it at some point. At the same time, I want to emphasize again, the plan is designed to maximize pushing people out, even as we reconfigure the force, continue to defend ourselves, and get ready to bring out our own equipment and ultimately our own military personnel.
And General, if I could just follow up on that, will you have to also develop alternative routes beyond those that you already have to get the remaining Americans in Kabul who want to leave safely to the airport?
So I would tell you that we have worked over the last week. We have brought in hundreds of Americans by working alternate routes to get them in, by establishing contact with them, by directing them down a steady different ways to get to the airport. Our task force, our JSOC element, does that on the ground very effectively in coordination with Admiral Vaisley, who's the overall commander there. So we continue to do that. That's not something that we're beginning now. We've done that all along, and we will continue to do that up until the last moment.
Jennifer.
General McKenzie, Jennifer Griffin, Fox News. Can you say, was there one or two suicide bombers at the Abbey Gate? And can you say for certain that it was a male bomber? And can you give us any more details about the second explosion that occurred at Barron Hotel? Was that a VBIED? Was that a car bomb? Or was that also a suicide bomber? Finally, there are State Department employees who are side by side with U.S. Marines at that gate. Were there any other U.S. citizens killed in the attack? And why were the Marines so close together that so many were killed in one strike?
So we think one suicide bomb at Abbey Gate. Don't know if it was male or female, just don't have that information. Don't know much about the second bomb, except one went off in the vicinity of the Barron Hotel, which, as you're aware, is a deeply bunkered structure. And as far as I know, there were no UK military casualties as a result of that. There may have been Afghan casualties, and I'm sure there were Afghan casualties. But it will take us a little bit of time to actually learn how many Afghans became casualties. We took some of them on board the installation. Many of them were taken to hospitals out in town. So what I see is what I get on open source reporting about the nature of those casualties. But we're trying to gather more information about it. So the last point, I would tell you, I don't know the size of the bomb, and the size of the bomb is directly related to how many people are going to be affected by the blast radius of the weapon. We are going to investigate that. As I've noted before, you're at the interface point there at these gates. Somebody's actually got to look someone else in the eyes and decide that they're ready to come in. And so we'll find out exactly what happened. Beyond that, I would not want to speculate at this time, Jennifer. Thank you.
Any other American citizens from the State Department who were killed?
None that I am aware of now.
Okay, I need to go back to the phones. Laura Seligman.
Hi, General. Thanks so much for doing this. A couple questions. First of all, can you tell me, we've heard reports of a third and possibly a fourth attack in Kabul today. Can you confirm those? And then also, can you tell us how exactly are you still conducting these evacuation flights? Are you concerned about manpads and other threats to the aircraft?
First of all, indications of other attacks in Kabul, but we have not been able to run that information down. So we see it. We get open source reporting on it, but I can't confirm that there have been other attacks in Kabul away from HKIA today. We continue to take a look at that very hard. I will tell you this: the safety of our aircraft coming in and out is of paramount importance, because obviously you have the opportunity there for 450 or more people to die if you have a significant mishap with the aircraft. We know that ISIS would like to get after those aircraft if they can. We don't believe they have a manpad capable of doing it. They have taken shots at our aircraft on occasion without effect. We think that's going to continue. And we will, but as you know, military aircraft have a variety of self-defense systems. What's more vulnerable actually are the charter aircraft and other aircraft that are coming in that do not have those systems. So we, with our ISR, we look very carefully at the approach pattern and the departure pattern off that runway to see what we, to see if we see any sign of something that might pose a threat to aircraft. That's one of the things that we look at religiously throughout the day and throughout the night as we conduct operations. Because really, the aircraft, the only way we're going to get people out of there. So we are keenly sensitive threats to our aircraft.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. I'm sorry, guys, we got to keep moving. We're going to take one more question and then give the general a chance to close out. Idris?
Sure. General, I know it's still early, but at this moment in time, how do you believe the suicide bombers made it through several checkpoints, whether it was Taliban or Afghan forces, to the Marines? Do you believe it was a failure, or they were able to somehow evade them and make it to the Marines?
Well, clearly, if they were able to get up to the Marines at the screening at the entry point of the base, there's a failure somewhere. It was a failure by, the Taliban operate with varying degrees of competence. Some of those guys are very scrupulously good. Some of them are not. I just don't know the answer to that question. But we will. You can be assured we're going to continue to take a look at it and try to make all our practices better as we go forward.
Okay, General, sir, we're going to let the general close out. General, sir, for any closing thoughts you might have, sir.
Hey, John, thanks. Again, I would just like to say today's a hard day, but the thing I come back to is the remarkable professionalism that the force on the ground is showing. As I've noted before, ultimately at these screening points in particular, you got to get very up close and personal to the people that you're bringing out. There's no way to do that safely from a distance. And we should all just bear in mind that we've been doing it for well over a week. We brought 104,000 people out. That's a tremendous number of contacts that every individual Marine, soldier, or sailor has had to have as we bring people aboard the airfield. It's a very heavy heart, that I do this conversation with you today. Nobody feels it more than me or the other members of the chain of command. We'll do everything we can to improve our practices there, to make sure it's as safe as possible for our folks on the ground that are doing this dirty, dangerous work. John, thanks very much.
Thank you, General. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
John, will you take a couple questions?
No, that's going to be.
So General McKenzie, the head of U.S. Central Command, speaking from the Pentagon, confirming that 12 U.S. servicemen were killed in the Kabul airport attacks. 15 others were injured, he said, and that it was carried out by 2 suicide bombers from the Islamic State, the IS group in Afghanistan. He said there is a threat of further attacks against the airfield. And of course, the Afghan health ministry also confirmed reports that dozens of Afghans, some 60 Afghan civilians, were killed in the blast. Children are thought to be among the dead. And actually, one of the bombs exploded along a sewage canal where many families had been waiting in polluted, foul sewage water in desperate attempts to try and reach the airport. So Alan Fisher is in Washington, D.C. He joins us live now. And so, Alan, I mean, the Pentagon knew there was a risk of something like this happening. We've just been hearing from the head of U.S. Central Command, who is in charge of preventing something like this. What did we learn about how these explosions and this loss of life took place?
I think the incredible thing is, if you stop and take a breath for a second, what we just heard was that after 20 years of the US going after the Taliban and pounding them and bombing the actual life out of them, they are now sharing information with the Taliban to try and stop others bombing them. 12 dead, 15 injured, undoubtedly a black day for the US military. What we got was an idea of what happened, that throughout this whole process, people have been coming to the gates at the airport. There, they have to be frisked. They have to be thoroughly searched to make sure they are not carrying a bomb onto the airfield and then latterly onto an aircraft. This is close-up war, said General McKenzie, and he praised the heroism of every single person who had to do these pat-down searches. You feel the breath of the person next to you as you're doing this, he said. And that is the point that he was making, that the way to make this safe is it has to be that close, that involved. And in just over a week, he says they've managed to process 104,000 people by doing that. What was also interesting is he said the threat hasn't gone away, that they're still aware that there will almost certainly be other attacks. Now, they talked about how they could prevent rocket attacks, how they have the ability to try and repel mortars attacking the international airport. But they said they don't have the ability to try and thwart something such as a truck bomb or another suicide bomb. And that has become abundantly clear in the last couple of hours. The threat is there, it remains, and something that the Americans have to work with. But General McKenzie also believed that he will get the job done on August the 31st. He was asked, did he think the Taliban helped let this attack happen? Just to be clear, General McKenzie very clearly blaming ISIL-K for this attack. He was asked, did he think the Taliban let this happen? And he pointed out that the Taliban actually have an incentive to let this operation continue at the pace it has been going, because they want all foreign fighters out of the country by August the 31st. And the way that is going to happen is not through attacking US forces at Hamid Karzai International Airport.
And on that matter of information sharing with the Taliban, very significant, as you point out, Alan, and the fact that these the evacuation operations will continue. He was very adamant about that. Does that mean deepening US Taliban involvement?
Well, we know that they've been in contact. We know that the director of the CIA has been talking to the head of the Taliban almost on a daily basis. We understand that many people object to that idea, but the reality, the real politic, is that the Taliban are in control across Afghanistan, in Kabul, and at the airport as well. And so the US, if they want to get this operation done with the figures and the numbers that they have on the ground, they have no other option but to deal with the Taliban. And so we are in the bizarre situation where they are now sharing information and sharing intelligence. The general said, obviously, they don't get the full picture, but they're still working with the Taliban to make sure that August the 31st will happen. Now, Joe Biden set that deadline. Remember, he'd set it initially as September the 11th, but realizing the political and emotional sensitivity of that date, he moved it to August the 31st. This is a self-imposed deadline, and now Joe Biden has got to work with that. Certainly we know that he asked for contingency plans if the way that the US was operating had to change by extending the date or perhaps even bringing it forward. Those contingency plans were presented to Joe Biden on Wednesday. You can almost certainly guarantee that across the Potomac, at the Pentagon, they are working on those contingency plans at the moment because of the events of the last few hours.
Thank you very much, Alan. Alan Fisher in Washington. Well, our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett joins us live. And Kimberly, of course, the Pentagon generals take their orders from the White House, and it would have been President Joe Biden's decision to have that reduced force of US troops, not just in Kabul itself, but to secure the airport. What further reaction has there been from his administration to all this?
Well, none. The first person we've heard really officially in the capacity is the general that just briefed that we took in its entirety. In fact, what we're waiting for is some sort of clarification or indication that the U.S. president may in fact speak to the American public, and we have not had that clarification. In fact, instead what we've had are delays or cancellations of the president's schedule as he has been briefed on and off throughout the day, at times in the Situation Room, a classified intelligence setting, in order to monitor and respond in real time to the events on the ground and to coordinate with the commanders on the ground. And that cancellation has included, for today at least, the meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. We also know that a meeting of governors who were to discuss with the president today, a virtual meeting about taking in Afghan that have fled, that has also been canceled for now or postponed. The White House press secretary also postponing her briefing, and we've not yet had a reschedule. And if you're hearing that noise, we've got a bit of a thunderstorm going on behind me. It is an extreme heat condition, which is not unusual for Washington, D.C., but it certainly does express the mood of this White House right now, not only somber because of the deaths, but the tough decision on Joe Biden's hands as commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, because he's been under enormous pressure to extend the deadline of August 31st in order to get all Americans and others who wish to be evacuated out. What we've had are the latest, as the president hold firm on that date, are the latest numbers from the U.S. State Department saying, in fact, that of the 1,500 remaining Americans at the airport or standing by to go to the airport, 500 of those have been evacuated. 1,000 more potentially are in contact and are preparing to leave, or, in fact, are choosing not to leave. Sorry, if I said 100, I meant 1,000, to give us that 1,500 number. So we've heard that the U.S. continues its evacuation mission, but certainly this is... Oh, sorry. Apologies, guys. We've a little bit of an electrical storm.
No, that's okay. You know what, Kimberly?
Wrap up. It's not exactly safe.
No. That's fine. Why don't you head off? Thank you very much for now, Kimberly Halkett, with all the latest from the White House. But, of course, we've had confirmation from the Pentagon that 12 U.S. servicemen were killed, dozens of Afghans, the health ministry saying 60 Afghans killed in this attack, children also among the casualties. But let's just take a closer look at the location we're talking about. Now, the airport in Kabul lies just 5 kilometers from central Kabul. Despite warnings of an attack, crowds of people with visas to evacuate were still gathered outside, trying to get on a flight out of Afghanistan. 2 suicide bombers targeted Abbey Gate and the nearby Baron Hotel, which British officials have been using to process Afghans hoping to leave the country. Witnesses have been describing what they saw when the explosions went off.
It was time for the evening prayer when an explosion happened. I saw about 70 vehicles carried around 150 injured to the hospital.
People were standing at the airport gate for evacuation when the blast happened. My cousin was also wounded on his leg, so he brought him to the hospital.
Well, this is the reaction that we've had from the Taliban. They've condemned the blast. Their spokesman has tweeted, the Islamic Emirate strongly condemns the bombing of civilians at Kabul airport, which took place in an area where U.S. forces are responsible in the Afghan capital, Kabul. It's been several hours, I think over 5 hours since these attacks took place. What's been happening there?
Yeah, I mean, a devastating attack late Thursday afternoon, this double explosion. And it's interesting hearing the general there talking about the complexities of trying to put a perimeter around the airport as this evacuation continues, about the day-to-day dealings with the Taliban. But as he explained there, the problems of trying to keep potential attackers away when you have to, at some point, try to process people at very close proximity to get them onto the airport. Talking about the cooperation with the Taliban, that they liaise with them, which we know about, and the Taliban here, confirm that. They say they do talk to the Americans, but also about the problems of trying to screen people, because there are literally thousands of people, and at different gateways around the airport, the kind of security that's in place does differ. So at the main terminal building, we've seen a real tightening of the security this Thursday, with the Taliban bringing in buses across the entrance, forcing people really very far back from the gate, the fences and the gates at the main terminal building. And that's where we've seen, really chaotic scenes of the Taliban firing volleys of shots to try to force people back. So this was after all of the warnings of an imminent attack, which we saw this Thursday. But then there are these other gateways, and that's what we've seen at the Abbey Gate, which is where these attacks took place. There are different routes to get there. It's not just the main road from the city to the airport, which the Taliban has roadblocks there. There are these other ways that you can get in, and that seems to be how the 2 bombers, suicide bombers, got in. But then this was what they describe as a complex attack. So it is in a number of different parts. It was the 2 bombs going off, but then also opening up with gunfire on the U.S. US Marines. And in the midst of all this, obviously we do know now that scores of people, of civilians, were also injured, and a number of them in double figures have been killed. And we've been seeing some awful pictures have been arriving here, reaching us of where these bombs took place, and really devastation, bombs amongst very crowded gatherings of people, leaving a lot of people dead, and also scenes from hospitals which have been dealing with the injured, lots of people being ferried to various clinics and hospitals. And it remains a very volatile, extremely tense situation this Thursday night. We're getting into just after midnight Thursday local time. As we came on air, we heard a big thud again coming from the direction of the airport. We don't know what that is. It could be another explosion. There have been bursts of automatic gunfire again coming from the direction of the airport. And just outside of our hotel here, about 5 or 10 minutes ago, there was a big commotion. There's a lot of shouting. We know that a vehicle or two was brought in, and then a lot of gunfire. And it does seem as though they potentially have been trying to clear people away. I think that this attack at the airport has made the Taliban around Kabul, which has remained relatively calm for the best part of 2 weeks since the Taliban took control. It has made them extremely nervous now, I think, about keeping control and about potential for more ISIS attacks or by the Islamic State. And so they are looking at areas of other potential other potential targets, which are some of the hotels or pickup points for where people tend to gather to go to be processed, to be put on evacuation flights, and they get taken off in buses to those points. Quite quickly, word spreads around the city of where these pickup points are, and you do tend to get large congregations of people gathering at these places. And this hotel and a number of other hotels are those potential places. So you do get the sense this Thursday night, Friday morning, that the Taliban is moving around and trying to deal with those targets before they become real targets and for attacks by ISIS bombers.
I mean, Rob, is it worth reflecting on how much courage it would have taken for Afghan civilians to make that journey just to get to the airport, where we saw thousands having to endure inhumane conditions just for a chance to get on one of these flights? If and when the gates open, are we likely to see the airport swarming with people again?
That's a really big question. I mean, that is a real concern. Let me just say that we heard this explosion a few minutes ago as we came on air. Our colleagues on Al Jazeera Arabic are now confirming that is another big explosion across at the airport. When we started to get all of these warnings throughout the past 24 hours, 36 hours, and it came from multiple sources. It was from different countries, from their intelligence services, from militaries, and also from the Taliban themselves. They were getting the same warnings about an imminent attack. In fact, we spoke to one security operative, a security source, earlier this Thursday, and he said he's never seen anything like that in Kabul, to get all of these different sources confirming the inevitability of this attack. And it did make everybody think about the going to the airport, all of the media organizations, our own included. We normally go there to the airport once a day, different parts of the airport. Ourselves, and I know other media organizations, steered away from that. It doesn't stop civilians going there. They, despite the warnings, the United States and its allies have been warning its citizens to stay away, and largely they have. They try to find other ways of congregating and going in mass in safer convoys or buses, or in some cases being choppered in by helicopters from predetermined rendezvous points. For the civilians or the ordinary people of Kabul who are desperate to get out, that doesn't seem to stop them. So sadly, we have had people congregating, still going to the airport, come what may. And it does beg the question of what happens as we start approaching this deadline of 31st of August. as the different countries wind up their evacuations, and we've seen that from the Canadians, Hungary, Poland, Belgium, Netherlands, all of these organizations have said they're wrapping up. Does that make people drift away thinking there's no chance of getting on a flight, or does it make them more desperate to go and get on the few remaining flights that there are?
Thank you. Rob McBride in Kabul. Well, the Islamic State group is saying that it was behind the attack which took place outside Kabul airport. This is reported on from the group's Amaq news agency, cited on its Telegram channel. Of course, that had already been confirmed just now by the Pentagon. They said that the attacks were carried out by 2 IS suicide bombers from the IS in Afghanistan group. So let's now speak to Eileen McCarthy from the Norwegian Refugee Council. She was airlifted out of Kabul last week and joins us live now from Durham, North Carolina via Skype. So you must have, I mean, you will be very familiar with the situation in and around the airport if this is a journey that you made yourself. Can you help us understand how this could have happened, or at least the process that you went through in order to leave the airport in terms of checks and security?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think the scenes that we have seen from Kabul today and in recent weeks have really been heartbreaking, and the desperate situation that so many Afghans have found themselves is really worrying. I think as the Norwegian Refugee Council, we have reduced our expatriate presence, but are very committed to staying and delivering the humanitarian assistance that's needed across the country. I think as we focused on the situation at the airport and the kind of desperation that we've seen from people there, we're also very conscious of the nearly 40 million Afghans who will be staying in the country, about half of whom are in need of humanitarian assistance. And once those other pathways through the airport or evacuations are reduced, being able to monitor what displacement looks like within the country and across to neighboring borders, I think will be really important for us to be able to actually be able to respond to those humanitarian needs of Afghans.
How vulnerable were the Afghans caught up in today's explosions?
I think what we've seen is a massive humanitarian crisis across the country even before the escalation of recent weeks. Even before the last few weeks when the authorities changed, there was conflict across the country. There is an ongoing drought in Afghanistan, and the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have just decimated the economy and people's resources. So what we were seeing even before the change of events in recent weeks is a dire humanitarian situation where people don't necessarily have the resources to put food on the table, to send their children to school, to be able to go to work on a daily basis and earn money for their families. So I think what we are seeing now in these scenes at the airport is that desperation coming to fruition and a real uncertainty about what the situation has in hand for the Afghans who will remain even after the next few weeks, and the real need for the international community to be able to respond to those people who will be left behind and who will be in need of ongoing humanitarian assistance and in need of services
can I ask
to be able
in
to
that
get
case,
back to...
given that the gates have been closed for now, what are the options facing many thousands, if not millions, of Afghans who might be trying to leave the country? Can you tell me which particular locations or border crossings you're watching closely now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the options are limited. We've seen borders mostly closed in recent weeks, but neighboring countries like Iran and Pakistan host about 90% of the Afghan refugees who are outside the country, and we're monitoring quite closely those border crossings as well as the irregular routes that Afghans take to seek international protection and asylum in other countries. So what we would like to see is those borders open and a commitment from the international community to enable Afghans to seek protection and asylum and not be in fear that they might be forced to return to the country in its current situation.
So are you in communication then with bordering countries, whether it be Iran and Pakistan, although I'm not sure how many are able to get through at this point, but in terms of making contingency plans and provisions for meeting the basic needs of Afghans that might end up crossing into those countries, or if they end up in a situation where they're sort of congregating and stuck on the border?
Yeah, so as the Norwegian Refugee Council and an operational organization, we are anticipating and trying to plan for what those movements might look like and what the needs of Afghans will be, both in Afghanistan and across the region. And as an interagency humanitarian community working together with UN agencies and other humanitarian partners, being able to engage with those member states to advocate for that safety and protection for Afghans, no matter where they are.
Right. So what are the most pressing needs right now? Are you focused on the internally displaced in Kabul, or do you have anything, are you operational at all outside of the capital in any of the provinces?
Yeah, so prior to recent weeks, the Norwegian Refugee Council was operational across about half of Afghanistan's provinces. So we have currently suspended most of our programming as we see how the situation plays out, and in order to ensure the safety and well-being of our staff as well as those people that we are aiming to serve. But we are very focused on the more than 500,000 Afghans who have been displaced by conflict this year, as well as the 3 million who were previously displaced. We have worked in government and non-government controlled areas for years and are really seeking to be able to continue to deliver that really critical assistance in line with the principles that we have operated under in terms of the independence and impartiality and neutrality that's really critical for enabling our work. We also work in neighboring countries as well as other parts of the world where we are very focused both on the immediate needs for protection and humanitarian assistance for Afghans, as well as that advocacy to make sure they have that space to seek international protection and asylum.
Eileen McCarthy from the Norwegian Refugee Council, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Let's return to Rob McBride. He's our correspondent in the Afghan capital, Kabul, joins us now. And obviously, Rob, we were speaking about the multiple explosions at Kabul airport earlier, but you were also citing further instability in the capital itself with some gunfire. Do you have any more detail on that?
Yeah, it remains extremely volatile here, both at the airport, which is a few kilometers away from us, and also on the streets around Kabul. And you kind of get to know what noises are coming from the airport, judging by the distance and also the volume of the sound by the time it reaches here, and what's happening in the streets, especially obviously nearby. But we have heard an explosion about 20 minutes, half an hour ago, and it was a very loud blast, and in fact our camera person here actually saw a flash from it. Now it could well be another type of attack, but we are also getting reports from other colleagues that this might be some actions being taken by one of the units that's helping the United States to guard the airport. This is one of the Afghan Special Forces units. There are a few Special Forces units that when the Afghan military surrendered, they didn't want to give up their arms. They went over and allied themselves with the US forces, and they're helping in the protection of the perimeter of the airport, on the understanding that with the last evacuation flights, they will have some of the last seats on those planes to be taken out of Kabul. Now, it could be, according to one of our colleagues, some way of them destroying some of their equipment, destroying something that might have an intelligence value. We simply don't know. It has to be said, I remember that when Kabul fell on the Sunday, the 15th of August, which seems like an awfully long time ago now, we did have something similar. There were all sorts of helicopter movements taking off from the US embassy compound, taking people to the airport. There were occasional shots ringing out, and then we did hear a few large explosions, and everybody got very excited. And in fact, it turned out to be rather mundane. This was just the US military destroying destroying sensitive files, computer files, other equipment that had intelligence value. So we're not quite sure what the latest explosions are coming from the airport. It may be some sort of attack. It may be something more mundane than that, of just the military there destroying something that has intelligence value. Meanwhile, there are still the occasional shots you hear being fired on the streets, and you do get a sense that everybody's extremely nervous. It is a very, very nerve-jangling Thursday night and now into Friday morning local time here in Kabul. Really, what's been going on at the airport, I think, has set everybody on edge, and we're in for quite a long night and waiting to see what tomorrow, Friday, also brings here, given the warnings of potential further attacks. And it's worth noting that we've heard from the US general there about the potential for bigger attacks, not just a suicide bomber, but also maybe a car bomb being used. And that's something we've also heard from the Taliban. They told us on Thursday that they had intelligence that potential car bombs could also be used. So we're in for a long night and a long day Friday.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Rob McBride in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Of course, we've been hearing from the United States, the Pentagon, saying that those evacuation efforts will continue beyond the US, though. Other Western powers, particularly the country's European allies, are also in a rush to evacuate thousands of their nationals and Afghans deemed at risk of reprisals. Now, I've been hearing from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who says that operations to evacuate British nationals and eligible Afghans will continue despite these explosions.
We're able to continue with the programme in the way that we've been running it according to the timetable that we've got, and that's what we're going to do, because the overwhelming majority of those who are eligible have now been extracted from Afghanistan, and we'll work flat out. The military, the Foreign Office teams, the Home Office, the Border Force teams are there, getting people through as fast as they can still. And we're going to keep going up until the last moment.
Charlie Angela joins me now with more on the reaction here in the UK, but also perhaps more generally, how have these attacks affected the UK and European evacuation efforts, Charlie?
Well, you heard there that it won't affect the UK timetable. 11 flights were scheduled to take place on Thursday to leave Kabul, and that's because ministers were really expecting these attacks and they had planned around them. There are still about 1,000 Afghan interpreters who are eligible for relocation to the UK, still stuck in Afghanistan, and the government is very keen to get them out. This has been a humiliating and hasty exit of their mission. But the attacks have also brought forward the evacuation from other countries a little bit earlier than planned. Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Poland, Hungary have all ended their evacuation flights. Germany's last flight took off very soon after those attacks, although they have said that they are willing to return with a medical evacuation flight to take any of those who were wounded in the attacks. Norway pulled out immediately after those attacks as well, saying it's probably had to leave some Norwegian citizens behind, but there was nothing that they could do. They couldn't get them through the gates of the airport, and that is the situation for a number of countries. France is saying it's going to continue flights until Friday. It has 20 buses outside the gates, and they're doing their best to evacuate them as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Charlie, very much. Going to be back with more coverage of this story in just a couple of minutes. We know that President Joe Biden will be addressing the nation in an hour's time. Do stay with us. I will see you shortly.
We understand the differences and similarities of cultures across the world. So no matter what moves you, we'll bring you the news and current affairs that matter to you.
Join Africa's largest trade and investment fair in South Africa. Intra-African Trade Fair gives you access to more than 1,100 exhibitors and 10,000 visitors and buyers, and more than 5,000 conference delegates, more than 55 countries. Participate in trade and investment deals worth $40 billion as business and government come together to explore business and networking opportunities at the international exhibition. Brought to you by the African Export-Import Bank and their premium partners, the IATF 2021, Transforming Africa.
As a resurgent Taliban retakes Afghanistan,
Female activists, journalists, and even schoolgirls are under threat. 101 East investigates the fight for Afghanistan's women on Al Jazeera.
This is St. Pauli. Despite being in Germany's second tier of football and without a single major trophy to its name, it has become one of the world's most iconic teams. And it's all down to their fans. But for them, St. Pauli transcends sport. For them, football is about politics, protest, and music. These fans see themselves in the vanguard of a global struggle against xenophobia, inequality, and racism. With over 500 supporters clubs outside Germany, they're able to spread their message far beyond their Hamburg home. But St. Pauli's history is far from innocent. The club is sending out a warning about the rise in popularity of far-right parties like the AfD. Nazis and fascists have no place in St. Pauli today.
I'm Mariam Namazi, watching Al Jazeera live from London with our ongoing continuing coverage of breaking news from Afghanistan, where as many as 60 people are reported to have died after a double bomb attack outside Kabul airport, where thousands were still gathered hoping to escape the country. Among those, a number of children were also killed. They are among the casualties. Also confirmation in the past hour that 12 US service personnel died in these attacks. But the US and UK are continuing to airlift people out. Several other countries, though, have stopped their evacuations early. Well, we're keeping the focus on Afghanistan. We've been hearing from the Pentagon over the past hour, but also the Taliban have said that at least 13 people were killed in two explosions outside the international airport. Medical sources, though, have told Al Jazeera as many as 60 people have been killed in the attack. The Pentagon also confirming that 12 US service personnel were killed, 15 others were injured. A number of children are also thought to have died. People were massed outside the airport, of course, where they've been for the past week, desperately hoping for a flight out of Kabul, despite the US, UK and Australia warning them to stay away because of an imminent threat from an ISIL affiliate. In the past hour, the Reuters news agency reports that the group has claimed responsibility. They have claimed responsibility themselves for this attack. The US and UK continuing to use the airport to evacuate their citizens, troops and Afghan allies, but Germany, Denmark, Belgium and Canada